You know, this summer I worked in a national park. You've probably all heard this from me by this point. I love to talk about it. But it was an interdenominational ministry where people of every Christian denomination were coming up, and I was having chapel services in this little tiny room overlooking Lake Superior. And I would joke every Sunday that it didn't matter what churches people came from, they were all from the same denomination that sits in the very back of the church. Because they always sat as far away from me as possible. I would sit up by the fireplace, and they'd all be up against the wall, maybe 4 feet away. You can come closer. But this is great. This looks better. Well, good evening. For those of you who don't know me, which I don't think is any of you, but I'm Eleanor. I'm the seminarian here at Christ Church. Thank you for joining us at the Lenten series again this evening. I'm sure most of you have been to more than I have, actually, because this is my first one. And I'd like to thank and introduce the very Reverend Dr. Ian Markham of Virginia Theological Seminary and the General Theological Seminary for joining us this evening to discuss our theme. So the goal of the Lenten series has been to bring questions from the world to the church. Does that sound right? Again, you guys know more than I do. And our question this evening is, in moments of distress, many people have tried praying, even if they are unsure about whether they believe in God. Some get what they asked for, others don't. How does prayer work? Is there a right or a wrong way to pray? How can someone believe in God when their prayers go unanswered? Which I have to say, this is a pretty live question for me. So for the majority of my life, I was an atheist. I've got about another 6 years in which I can continue to say that before the Christian years tick over. But I was a skeptical little kid, and I recognized immediately that people were praying for things, and sometimes, most of the times even, they don't happen. Actually, people have done studies on this. Since 1872, I went and looked this up. The first study on the efficacy of prayer happened in 1872. We have been trying to scientifically verify if prayer is efficacious. The jury's out so far, but it doesn't look good. Most studies show up a negative correlation between putting prayer in and getting action out. It would appear that God is not a vending machine. Thank you, that was funny, wasn't it? So, with all that considered, I'm sure plenty of you have had situations when you've prayed for something rather intently and it hasn't happened. I know I have. The big defining feature of my life, my adult life, has been a lost love situation. I was engaged and it ended, and Lord knows I prayed for that not to happen. Hasn't come back yet. And I'm sure you all have similar stories. So if you could take maybe the next 5 minutes or so to discuss this theme, this question, how this has arisen in your life, what you've prayed for that hasn't come up, how people have talked about this to you, how you've considered it. And then we'll reconvene in 5 minutes or so and discuss the topic. Sound good? All right. Start in your groups. 7:16, we'll be back at 7:21. All right. Hello, hello. Good evening. We can wrap up our conversations now and come back to the main group. I'm just remembering, by the way, that I should warn you all. This is being recorded and live streamed to go out later. Not visually anything, but voices will be heard, which we're about to hear your voices, so it's time for you to know that. So, what themes, questions, responses came out of your conversations in your groups? And if you'll raise your hand, I'll come over and bring the mic for you to share. Will? All right.
Someone had to go. Thank you. We talked about prayer as gratitude or giving thanks in prayer. I mentioned not praying for specific things. Give me this and that. Unanswered prayers.
Answered, you just didn't know that you needed them. We were also talking about unanswered prayers, that they may actually be prayers answered. You just didn't know what you needed.
Yeah, certainly. Unanswered prayers can be prayers answered. Yeah, God's reach is long and his sight is far. What else came up in people's discussions? Come over here. It's a rather tight room.
We also kind of said that like a lot of us didn't pray for like specific outcomes, but rather like praying like that God's will be done and like to have strength when like that might not be like our first thought or like our desire of like what the situation's outcome was, but like knowing, like praying like for God's will and then like for strength for us to get through the next situation.
That's a classic prayer, isn't it? Not my will, but thine be done. What else? Any other groups? Over. Peter, women always have all the intelligent things to say.
I think we can ask God for things, just to be clear, but I talked about how I had a friend in college who kind of taught me how to pray in this way of like having a two-way conversation with God. She called it listening prayer. I don't think she's the only one who calls it that, but she taught me how to do it, where you ask God questions and thinking about prayer as this being with God as opposed to just either expressing gratitude or asking for things, where there's no sort of response from the Holy Spirit. Yeah, that helps me think differently, because then you can actually hear from God like what you should want.
Embroidering on that, it's important to be conscious of the presence of the Holy Spirit, and prayer is a way of connecting so that you can have it shape your character and how you move through problems, and it gives you wisdom. If it shapes you to wise decisions, then prayer is successful.
Thank you. Right, so we're seeing back here themes of prayer as dialogue and conversation, not just a one way, but also an expectation to hear back from the Holy Spirit, and for a goal of prayer shaping us in wisdom. What else came up in people's conversations?
Make you do the long march. Maybe we're a more pessimistic table, but we talked about how we get angry with God, and I think I'll speak from my perspective. I've kind of been guided that if you're going to have a real relationship with God, it doesn't always have to be rosy and like putting your hands together and kneeling by your bed at night and saying, thank you so much for such a wonderful day, and, thy will be done. That, no offense to your table, that is very good. You should keep doing that. But kind of having this more like, sometimes angry of like, either you told me, to do something and I did it, and so why didn't you do the thing that I thought I was going to get out of it? Or I really prayed hard for this job and I really wanted it. Why didn't I get it? And I think this is not a private story, so I don't mind telling it, but Nate, Father Nate, was telling me that he went through something in his early adult life that was really impactful, and he was angry with God and he was yelling and crying, and his dad, who's also a minister, said, you can yell at God, he can handle it. And I think that was really an impactful story for me to hear, of like, we don't always have, if we're really supposed to have a true relationship with God and a real relationship, I think sometimes being angry with the ones who we love is a normal response and emotion.
I'll add on, it's not just normal, it's eminently scriptural, too. If you read the Psalms, David, or the psalmist, historical critical scholars here, is often very angry with God. So I think we're coming up on 5 minutes. Does anyone else have anything burning on their heart, mind, soul that they want to share? All right. Well, in that case, we'll hand things off onto the very Reverend Dr. Ian Markham.
Let me just see if you can hear me okay. Is that all right? Well, thank you for inviting me back. Thank you for turning up again. Can I just say how impressed I am with you all? It's chilly outside, and you're here, and it reflects on what a healthy, vibrant congregation this is. And you're blessed with two of our seminarians, and it's lovely to be with Eleanor, who's now going to tell me, I've told this joke in class on Monday, but this is my favorite prayer joke. So a little kid, we'll call him Johnny, is desperate for an Xbox. This might be old technology. Is there a more up-to-date technology a kid should be praying for? Anyway, bear with me for the Xbox. And Johnny kneels down beside his bed, and he says, Jesus, I will be good for a whole week if you give me an Xbox. And he stands up and he thinks to himself, actually, a week's a long time. So hang on, I'll revisit this. So he kneels back down, he puts his hands together in the praying posture. He says, Jesus, I will be good for 3 whole days if you give me an Xbox. And then just at that moment, the mother yells up the stairs saying, Johnny, you left your toys out again. I've told you. Oh, he thinks, oh no, this ain't going to work. So he looks around the room and he notices a statue of Our Lady, the Virgin Mary. And he thinks to himself, I've got an idea. He goes and gets a towel. He carefully wraps the statue of the Virgin Mary in the towel, goes to the bedside cupboard, opens the drawer, puts the towel with the Blessed Virgin Mary wrapped inside it into the drawer, and then resumes his kneeling posture. Jesus, if you want to see your mother again, yes. So, prayer. Well, there's a handout. This is my style. And I'm going to make the problem a little bit more complicated for a moment, because I think the great thing about being Episcopalian is we're not afraid of questions, okay? We don't hide from them. We think through things as far as we're able to go. Faith, if it's true, can withstand challenges and questions. So I've identified 6 little difficulties that we might have with prayer. And the obvious one is, look, God knows everything. So God knows if you've got a medical condition. God knows if you once loved and you've lost. God knows if you're desperately miserable at work. God knows if you really want to pass a driving test. God knows if you were desperate for that promotion. God knows that, and so the list goes on. You're worried about a friend of yours. The kids are acting out. Whatever it is, God knows all that. So what's the point to pray? I mean, it's not like God needs to be told, because God already knows this stuff. So let's just start with that little difficulty. It's called the problem of omniscience. It literally means all-knowing. What's the point of telling God stuff, given God already knows? Right, that's the first difficulty. The second is, now God is jolly bright. I don't normally say jolly. I'll just pause there. How do you translate jolly? Very. God is very bright, okay? So God is, God can work out what's the best outcome in any given situation, right? Whether that person should get better, whether that person should get the job, whether that person should be healed. Whatever it is, God. So therefore, again, why are we sitting down with an omniscient, all-powerful being, telling him stuff that God already knows, and then sort of suggesting how God ought to proceed in this given situation? I mean, surely God can work out what the best direction might be. So that's the second difficulty with prayer. Remember, always 10 minutes into your my talks, if you were here last week, you're an atheist. This is my style, okay, right? We pose the problem and think it through. Okay, number 3. Now, what's interesting about people who pray is you often turn to somebody else and say, Eleanor, I'm really worried about my son Luke. Do you mind praying for him, please? In fact, a lot of Christians do that. You share a problem, and they'll say, I'll pray for you. What's going on there? I mean, what's the point of asking lots of people to pray to God? I mean, what is God? A senator who will be persuaded if more people lobby? Give me a break. This just makes no sense at all. What? God is going to be impacted if 100 people pray, or 1,000 people pray, or 1,000,000 people pray? Really? God is going to take all those prayers over one solitary prayer from somebody in need? It just doesn't make sense, does it? What a strange thing to do. You can tell it's strange because my voice has gone squeaky. Okay, that's difficulty number 3. Number 4 is the obvious one, which in a weird sort of way links with the theme of last week. What's interesting is you can have 2 children on a leukemia ward, and one recovers and one does not. And in both cases, somebody was praying, be assured. If you're in a children's leukemia ward, people are praying. And yet one recovers and one does not. Now, surely, God's either going to heal both or, for whatever reason, not heal both. It seems really unfair to heal one and not the other. The interesting thing about, an accident, right? You have a tragic accident, a train hits another train, significant numbers of people are killed, and then one comes out having survived unscathed. And you'll hear that person being interviewed, and they'll say, it was a miracle, I survived. And you sit and think, well, hang on. If God's going to save that one person, why didn't God save the whole carriage? It seems a little indulgent to say, hey, it's a miracle I got saved, so what's that imply? If God was doing something in that situation, then why save just one and not everybody? Why not stop the accident? Surely that would be much wiser. The 5th difficulty is, in traditional Christian theology, the future's already known. God knows exactly how the universe is going to unfold to the end of time, which means if God knows our future, then there's a sense in which what will be will be. I mean, it's not obvious how we can make any difference. We can't falsify what God already knows about our future, so therefore surely it's just all going to unfold regardless of what we do or whether or not we pray. So you have the problem of human agency and participation in all this. And then the final difficulty is the problem of science. When you're in the old days, when you used to watch the weather forecast, now this is for anybody who's you know. I mean, I don't think my son's 29, and I don't think he's ever watched a weather forecast, right? He gets his news on Reuters, he reads The Economist, you know, but he doesn't sit and watch the news and doesn't wait till you get to the weather forecast. So imagine, do an empathetic act back to the, when do they all fade away? I mean, back to the whatever. I think you can probably still find them somewhere. Okay, anyway, point is, when you're watching this old-fashioned technology and you're learning about the weather tomorrow, you know, you'll get a description of air pressures rising, clouds moving, pressure falling, precipitation therefore arriving, all over Alexandria, all over DC, all over Maryland, right? You'll get that narrative. And when the weather forecaster's going through the weather forecast for tomorrow, they don't suddenly pause and say, but what's really interesting is Mrs. Marple is praying desperately for good weather for her grandson's birthday party, which is going to be in her backyard. And, oh, look, there's a big, massive finger making a little hole in Georgetown, just right over that backyard, which is in the weather forecast for tomorrow. You never hear that said. You know, it is just, the explanation scientific, and there doesn't seem to be any space in the scientific narrative for a divine intervention.
Except it's wrong 50% of the time.
Yes, that's true, that's true. But even when it's wrong, it's like all wrong, like it all becomes sunny or it all becomes wet. It doesn't normally have one backyard with a big finger over the top giving sunshine to that particular space and locale. Now, of course, so what's the exercise here? The exercise is to commend you who came up with these questions, because it's a really good question for Christians to think through. So let's start thinking it through. And you'll know, let's start with the science bit of it. Do you know what's interesting about the description of science that I just provided is we now know it's false. You know, basically, what a lot of people still live with is a Newtonian mechanistic account of the universe. Now, Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, 17th century scientist, sitting ostensibly in Trinity College in Cambridge University, an apple fell on his head, and he had the bright idea of a fundamental law as a law of gravity, right? That Newton. You know, he was amazing. I mean, he was an extraordinary guy. I mean, he spent a lot of time doing alchemy. He was obsessed with the book of Daniel. These were the works he was most proud of. Nobody knows any of this about him now. Instead, he's, of course, famous for creating the basic laws of physics and ushering in the scientific revolution. And his big idea was extraordinary. He said, basically, you can make sense of the universe in terms of mathematics, and certain fundamental laws shape the universe. That was his big insight. And, of course, from him, we got the analogy that the universe is basically like a machine. Now, before that, Aristotle used images of a plant, some very different images for the universe. But it was Newton who came along and said the right way to think about the universe is it's like a big machine, like a big, another old technology, a big grandfather clock. You know, it's just something which once you set it going, it should just continue. And what happens next is determined by the prior state, right? That's the picture of the universe that Newton ushered in. And if you have that picture of the universe, then you see the universe is here. It's like a big machine. And of course, prayer becomes a big finger over the backyard of Mrs. Marple's home, where she wants sunshine for her grandson. And that creates the problem. You know, God then is constantly intervening. You know, in the two leukemia patients, one God is intervening in and the other God is not. Right? You have this big picture of an interventionist God. Do you see the problem? The thing is that science, and there'll be people in this room who know more about this than me, but that science is not true. Now, got to be careful. It's true at the level of tables, chairs, people, you, me, but it's not true when it comes to vast distances and fast speeds. Einstein's theory of relativity, and it's not true when it comes to the atomic and subatomic level. A proton is walking into a hotel. The bellboy says, "Do you have any luggage?" The proton replies, "No, I'm traveling light." Okay, so we know at the level of the subatomic level, the world is just really mysterious, really puzzling. We know, for example, that the observer partly determines what is found. You can ask the question about the location or motion, but not both, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We know, for example, that some things are ghosts, some things are uncaused. This makes up everything. This universe is really peculiar at the subatomic level. Okay, well, let's live in this space for a moment. So the picture we have of the universe is not that it's a big machine which basically observes in a linear way certain fundamental laws, but suddenly we have a universe that's open, that certain things are uncaused, that there's a connection between butterfly wings and a hurricane, hundreds, thousands of miles away. So we have a completely different picture of the universe. Okay, now we might be starting to think what prayer might be. And we've got to get there by going first to understanding the spirituals. So let me explain that step first. The interesting thing about the mind is it's clearly linked to the brain, because if you chop up a brain, you will damage your capacity to think and reason and imagine, right? So there's clearly a link. But they're also very different. So if you now think for a moment about, I don't know, the last time you were by the sea, you were walking along in the sand, you were with somebody you love, it's a beautiful day, you can conjure up in your mind a picture, and if I attach you to a big machine, I'll never find that picture. I'll see brain activity, sure, but I'll never find that picture. The machine can't find that picture. In fact, the machine can't find the thoughts that underpin a picture. So it's very interesting. So mind is linked to brain and yet different. Okay, now bear with me. Perhaps the right way to think about God and this universe is that God is like the mind that permeates matter. God is the spirit that weaves in and through everything. When I think about my experience of God, I always find it difficult to explain to somebody what it means to sense God. Now, I've been granted that occasional moment when it's a very intense experience, but actually, more generally, my sense of God is like a constant presence that permeates everything that happens to me. Try this for an analogy. When you're in a restaurant with a group of friends and you're really enjoying the conversation and it's really relaxed and it's very pleasant, and you're conscious of other diners and they're at the edge and they're all there, but your focus is on your table. Well, God is like, for me, the other diners, right? Even at this moment, I'm conscious that God's at the edge of my experience. So even now, I sense that I'm in a universe intended and surrounded by spirit. Do you get the picture? So God is like the spiritual element that pervades this universe. In the same sense that when humans make a decision, right? So I'm going to make a decision. I'm getting up in the morning. I'm trying to decide whether to have a croissant from Wegmans. Do you know, Wegmans croissants and their orange juice is pretty close to to Paris. I mean, it's just like an extraordinary experience. I commend it to you. Or, because, you know, that's a lot of carbs and my trousers are tight, I'm thinking about Weetabix, which is an English breakfast cereal that tastes like straw, and a banana. Okay, so I'm making that decision. Now, the interesting thing about decisions is suddenly on the new physics, for Newton's universe, the decision was a puzzle. But on the new physics, we know that things can be uncaused. So a decision literally is that moment when something uncaused in the brain permits the mind to make the healthy choice and go for Weetabix and a banana and deny myself the thrill of a Wegmans croissant and orange juice. Okay, so that, now, once you start thinking like that, we're getting a picture of the universe. It's a long way from Newton's machine. Suddenly, the picture of the universe is that there is all of matters permeated by spirit. And the Christian claim is that that spirit is primary, right? God is immaterial. And God has created and infused the material with God's presence. So the right way to think of God is everywhere and in everything, okay? And also beyond. So God's not just identical with the world, but also the cause of the world. So God is the cause, the immaterial is here, and God creates and infuses and permeates everything in creation. Okay, so once you're here, then we can start understanding what prayer is. Somebody talked about the importance of the relationship and getting angry with God. That's part of it. You're in constant conversation with the spiritual that infuses everything, that invites you into a relationship to orientate your life so it's focused on love and not self. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes you can't be bothered. Sometimes you're hurt. So you're in conversation with the Spirit that permeates everything. And then prayer. So what is prayer? Prayer is that conversation where you don't necessarily ask for anything. You're just aware that the Spirit is present in everything you're experiencing, and you want to live aware of that reality and the demands it makes on your life as a human being. But then prayer does come conversation, and you will say, I'm worried sick about my brother who fell off a ladder, hit his head, and was hospitalized. Now, what are you doing when you pray? What you're doing is you are creating space in the creation that God's made for God to use that space to be a player in the healing. Okay, so what do you do when you pray? You're creating space in God's creation for God to use that space to assist in the role of healing. So there are going to be lots of factors in whether or not my brother gets healed. You'll be pleased to hear he's fine. Well, he's a bit strange. But he always was beforehand. And he keeps beating me at Polytopia. But leaving aside those two vices, he's functioning very, very well. Thank you very much. And I'm going across to celebrate his 70th birthday in Holy Week. I feel a bit guilty about this, but anyway, we'll ignore that little detail. Okay, so what happens is God invites us to really concentrate and for God to use the energy, if you like, that we create to assist in the work that God's able to do in any given situation. Now, you can pray for all sorts of things. Remember, there are lots of factors that are operating in any given situation. So yeah, do pray for Ukraine, right? But you've got to remember, of the many factors that God's seeking to accommodate, you've got a Russian army, you've got a an expansionist Putin. You've got the limitations, the smallness of Ukraine. So all these factors are true. In other words, human agency, human free will, human decisions. Some are cooperating with God. Sometimes we're restricting God and obstructing God. So God's got to navigate all that too. But into that mix, every single time you pause and really focus on Ukraine. Now notice, prayer here isn't simply listing the name. Between you and me, I think the sort of shopping list prayers of church are pretty useless. I think it's nice that we do them, but it's not just, hey, Lord, I just want to drop a name into your attention. It's when you sit and think, okay, I'm really worried about my brother. I'm going to spend some moments sitting in this place with you, and I'm going to actually use everything I can to create some space so you can use your healing power to bring relief from the predicament he's facing. So prayer is, and that's the reason why asking lots of people makes a difference. Because then you have a lot of energy being given to that situation and that difficulty. And sometimes something I do as a personal discipline is I pause and I allow myself some time where I just pray for somebody who's got nobody to pray for them. In other words, I say, Lord, I'm going to give over a little bit of my prayer energy this morning because you'll be able to use it to help somebody who's alone and afraid and nobody knows about them. Now, how do I know all this is true? Well, I want to suggest that this is actually what you get from the biblical record. If you look at the account of prayer in the biblical record, all these features are there. Prayer's a conversation, for sure. Prayer's an invitation to get mad with God, for sure. Prayer is an invitation that God can use to make a difference. There's that lovely expression, the prayers of the saints availeth much, that can make a difference to any given situation. There is a constant invitation in the biblical witness to invite others to pray. Paul endlessly says, look, for heaven's sake, pray for the church in Jerusalem. They've run out of money. So that's in Corinthians. So, you get this sort of picture of prayer from the biblical witness. And what's weird is it's actually quite compatible with the picture that you get from science. We might be, this is a really strange thing to say, we might be the generation that's living at a time where this sort of talk is more intelligible than it's ever been before. Because the picture you get of the universe from modern cosmologies and from physics is of this intrinsically open universe that has space at the subatomic level, that is very much the realm of the spiritual, where the spiritual permeates everything that is and functions in extraordinary ways, where human agency and divine agency can make a difference. Let me just try a little analogy with you. When my son and I went on a college trip, which was really cool, we went to, it's nice because you end up spending days with your son, and it's coming at a stage of life where you know it's going to end, right? Because university's next, and basically I didn't spend much time with my father once I went to university. It's just the way it all ended up going. And so it's a very precious season, these college trips, and he wanted to look at some institutions on the West Coast, so we flew all the way out to Los Angeles, and we visited 2 or 3 schools in the California university system. And because we were hanging out together, by the time you've discussed everything important, like in our case, English soccer teams, what movies we should be watching, what my views are about this and that, you end up thinking, okay, we've got to find some other way of occupying time together. So we ended up playing Risk on an iPad, which is a silly game of world domination, where the idea is you take over the world. And you can set up bots. So you end up, say, Luke's playing on his device, I'm playing on mine, and we've got 3 bots. Okay, let's try this as an analogy. think of God as the entity who creates the operating system. So God is that which makes any game possible to play, because God is Steve Jobs. God is the Apple operating system, iOS or whatever it is. God is all that. God is creator. And then think of Luke and me as players. We're players in the game. And sometimes we're mean. I won't attack you there. And then you cheat and sweep right in. And sometimes you're good. Let's build an alliance against this bot. Okay? And then let's further imagine that there's another player also playing in the game. And that player is sometimes resisting my propensity to cheat, and sometimes encouraging when I'm trying to build alliances and do something right. That other player is how God wants to move in this universe. Yeah? So the picture you end up with is of a spiritually infused universe. And what God is constantly doing to us all is inviting us to create the next segment of creation with God. We do that through our actions. Do loving things rather than cruel things. Be generous rather than mean. Be supportive rather than not supportive. Right? You do that through your actions. And in addition, you do it through prayer. You create space in a day where you sit not just to generate the relationship with God, but also to share with God everything that you're worried about, preoccupied by, concerned about, and just say, okay, Lord, make a difference in this space, please. And you just contribute, and God uses that space to create options that otherwise would not be there. In other words, God really does want our input and participation. God is game to do this work with us. And if we are constantly obstinate and refusing to create space for God and playing a selfish, narcissistic, self-preoccupied, egotistical, mean life, then sure, we become an obstacle that God's constantly trying to work around. That's the picture of prayer I commend to you tonight. Do you know, Eleanor and I hosted a conference over the Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. And there were lots of complex dynamics in this conference we were hosting. And I prayed in a very concentrated way, both before and during, that the Spirit that animates everything will be present, and that challenges that might arise might be ameliorated. I do it before a difficult meeting, where you're giving feedback to a colleague which will be hard. I do it when I'm navigating New York's Attorney General office and trying to get approval for a lease arrangement for a campus that I'm responsible for in Chelsea. And I really believe it makes a difference. I think God takes the energy I create and it makes a difference to the moment that I'm in. So let's go back to those 6 difficulties then. Sure, God knows everything, but God does not know for sure which future will materialize. Okay. The Virgin Mary could have said no. There's a great poem about whether or the angel Gabriel had asked 6 other Marys before getting to Mary, who finally said yes. God has created this universe to actually function in cooperation with us. And is it my phone, is it? No. Just check. So that's, so in other words, God does not know exactly how things are going to fold out because God's created a universe in which there are free creatures. God does know everything that's ever happened. God does know everything that's happening now. God does know all the possibilities of what might happen, all the different futures that might unfold. But God has said, okay, humanity, I'm game to share the next segment of creation with you. I'm especially eager to have people who want to progress love and mercy and justice rather than be selfish, egotistical, and mean. Okay, are you up for this? Okay, and the next segment keeps unfolding, and it's a constant battle between our angels and our demons as we create the next segment of creation. God is not going to just enable the best outcome to materialize because that's not how God works. God invites us to create, and there are actually 1,000 million possibilities that are acceptable. There are lots of possibilities that are not, but God is not just saying there's one linear train track route that we all take. No, God is actually open to a number of different futures and invites us to participate in creating that next future. The reason why you ask people is not because God's a senator, but you ask God you invite others to participate in creating space for God to make a difference for the healing of a child or a friend or of a neighbor who's going through a difficult time. You allow those prayers to be used by God to create options. When God is handling, why does one child of leukemia survive and the other does not? The answer there is this. There are 1,000 factors that enable God to sometimes use the prayers of people to make a difference, and sometimes God cannot make a sufficient difference. So, for example, I do take the view that, somebody, my sister-in-law, Elaine, missed a step at church, fell over, damaged her wrist. Okay, broke it. God can do more there than God can when you're up against a Nazi machine that's herding Jewish people into gas chambers. Because the prayers that create some energy and space for God to use in the healing of Elaine's wrist, with the aid of doctors in her case, that can work in a way that it doesn't work when there's intense evil doing everything it can to obstruct God's agency. So when it comes to two people in a leukemia ward, there will be, and this is the only moment I'll invoke the word mystery, there will be a fundamental mystery about why it was possible for God to do one and not the other. But there will be some explanation about why that was the case. And then the problem of science has just gone away. We've just got to move on our picture of God and recognize that we now live in a different space, a different time, where suddenly prayer makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Well, now it's 8:06, and we all have to be in the church by 8:15 for Compline. So if we want to take maybe 1 or 2 minutes to discuss in our groups, and then we'll open it back up for questions again to Dean Markham. Sound good? 1 or 2 minutes. All right. That was a quick 1 or 2 minutes. You'd almost think a minute is only like a minute long or something. So, coming back to the main group now, what questions do we have for Dean Markham? We have one here. All right, I'll wait.
In your simple example of praying for someone who is sick and the creation of that space to invite a loving God into, who's being healed?
So I do take the view. So there are other accounts of prayers in the literature. One of them is the primary purpose of prayer is to express concern for each other. And another mechanism of prayer is to help yourself come to terms with what's unfolding. So there are all those other possibilities in the literature. I believe in miracles. I'm the only theologian working in America. No, that's not true. I really do think that God can make a difference. Now, most often in cooperations with doctors, nurses, and medicine. You know, I'm a big fan of living in the 21st century, and I'm really grateful for antibiotics. But I also take the view that when you pray hard, you can sometimes make a difference that God alone is bringing about. Most of the time, God does it in cooperation with human agency and action, like a caring nurse, all the way down to medicine. But theoretically, and from time to time, the miraculous does occur where God is literally the primary vehicle of the healing.
Other questions?
I do struggle a little bit with leukemia example. If you could unpack that. You said there would be mystery and maybe some explanation.
Okay, so there is a certain truth about illness and mortality. So my mother-in-law is 93. She is really well. She wakes up every morning, does Wordle in 3. She sits me down and tells me her views about the world. She's mobile. She's very, very gifted. But it's also true that any 93-year-old who tumbles down a set of stairs, there will be a point at which even the energy of prayer, unpacking a situation, will will not be sufficient to bring about a quality of life that's recognizable as healing, right? You know, I mean, to pray endlessly for somebody to be on a ventilator machine for a year is not an answer to prayer. So I think the way you want to look at this is in any situation, there are 5, 6, 8, 10 factors at work, right? There's human agencies there's material factors, there are health-related factors, there's the age of the patient, there's a whole subsection, you know, previous diet. I mean, there are all sorts of things that go on in any health-related incident. So the way to think about prayer is prayer will make a difference. And the difference might be that I remember praying with somebody who was nearing death, and they needed to see his son again, right? That was really important. And so we focused all the energy on that, and that prayer was answered, and then he died. And I think that's what you want to always think about prayer is not so much God's a participant in a complex situation with numerous factors operating, some of which make it possible for prayer and divine agency to bring about healing, and sometimes prayer and divine agency is not able to counteract the other factors at work in the situation. You don't say any of this to people who are in these situations. You just feed on the psalmist who says, I'm angry with God, and that's in one sense a totally appropriate, legitimate answer. That might be what needs to be said. But if you ask me as a theologian, with the account of prayer I've just presented, how do I make sense of it? The answer in brief is in any situation there are a multitude of factors operating, and sometimes it's possible for recovery to be an outcome in one, and in another it isn't.
We've got time for maybe one more quick question.
Sorry. I'm going to take somebody else's question and ask it. Sorry. I'm interested in the comparison, or the reason that prayer creates this space for God to intervene. But how do you answer that for God being omnipotent?
Right. So when God could create a million universes. God could have chosen to create any universe that God wanted to create. God chose to create a universe where one of the goals of the universe is the flourishing of love. Into that universe, necessarily, God's got to have creatures that can resist and thwart love and frustrate love. And into that situation, you're going to get a universe that lives with the complexity of multitude of factors swirling around almost everywhere you go. So God is still omnipotent in the sense God could have created any universe, but God deliberately restricted God's agency and action to have this universe with us, with the goal of us participating in the next segment of creation. And God deliberately restricted God's agency to invite us to be one of the mediums that bring about energy that God can use in prayer. My pleasure.
All right, well, it is 8:15 on the dot. Can we give another round of applause for Dean Markham? And let's all head into the church for Compline. Thank you all, and a happy Lent.